like you and your dynasty tiers have them in the same tier, but we have talked about how like maybe Allen and Mahomes are a half tier.
Yeah, they might belong in a super tier.
Yeah.
Because clearly they're not being traded at the same value.
But Pitts is a premium non-quarterback. So to get a premium non-quarterback is
right. I mean, there are only 4 guys who aren't quarterbacks in that top tier for me. Chase, Jefferson, Taylor, and Pitts. And you might even say, we talked about the trade that Monty Fun and I did where we moved into Taylor from Burrow. There were a few other things involved, but it was a pretty close 1-for-1. But I think that, you could easily argue that Taylor is the least value of all of those guys because Kyle Pitts, unless something goes wrong, I mean, we expect him to go and, I mean, you see some of the trades still that happen for Travis Kelce, and they're absurd because of just how much of a field tilter Kelce has been. You look at the situation with Mark Andrews, even with how their offense probably becomes run heavy again, or at least more balanced than you would like to see. You look at the situation with Waller, who's older. You have Kittle, who is older now. And again, there are offensive concerns. If you have one of these guys who's an elite talent and an offense that has the pass volume, I don't know. I mean, I love this trade for the person who moved back. I think it makes sense for the other person as well. I mean, one of the things is when you execute a trade like this, then the key thing is not so much to worry, like, was it a good trade? Was it a bad trade? But just continue to execute your plan. Because once you have Josh Allen, now if you don't make egregious mistakes as you build, you're going to have a good team. Right. Yeah. So even though you've spent a lot, you're going to have a good team. The same thing, though, can be true for the other manager and maybe even to have more ceiling because now you have Kyle Pitts, this extra pick, future picks. This is one of those fun ones where I think it works out for both sides. And
sure.
But it creates very different scenarios for both sides. So now they have different things that they have to accomplish. What are some of the other players sort of in these first 2-3 rounds that jump out to you as being sort of interesting decision points or tier breaks or surprises? What are you seeing here? You mentioned that there were a lot of QBs going. One of the things that I think is kind of fun about the RotoViz Triflex leagues over at the FFPC is that there's a cap on drafting QBs of only 3. And that creates kind of the dynamic to where you don't have that one person in your league who thinks that having like 6 or 7 is going to give them kind of the monopoly on trade value with the QBs. I mean, that damages the league again, which is something that, we're looking to not have happen. But it also does deflate the QB ADPs a little bit because drafters know that they're not going to be completely locked out probably. You were saying that the second round in your league was very QB heavy.
It was. So it started with those 6 QBs that I mentioned. Chase went 7, Watson went 8, Jefferson and AJ Brown. And then at 111, you mentioned that Taylor maybe was the lowest of the non-QBs or maybe should go the lowest. The individual who traded out of the Josh Allen pick did have their choice of Kyle Pitts or Jonathan Taylor. I actually liked that they took Pitts in tight end premium. I feel like he's going to probably hold his value longer in a startup. I'm right there with you. And so Taylor went 112, Lamb went 201. And then the next round went Lance, Prescott, Wilson, Hurts, Matthew Stafford. Tee Higgins and Debo go, and then Trevor Lawrence and DeAndre Swift. And that's where I was on the clock at 211. A lot of QBs had gone in that list. And, obviously I just read a lot of names. That's not always great audio, but a lot of those were QBs. It was the point I was trying to make. I was on the clock there with a Mahomes team, and you're asking for interesting names. The biggest names that were standing out to me were Cooper Kupp and Christian McCaffrey. Were like, I didn't necessarily want to build that way, but especially with Kupp, I'm looking at it like I can start a roster with Patrick Mahomes and Cooper Kupp. This feels like a pretty good way to build a team. And I was seriously considering that. I mean, he's obviously not likely to hold his value as well at his age, and the same would be true for Christian McCaffrey. Andrews was the other name I was going to consider if I wasn't able to move out. Probably would have been my pick. And then Breece Hall, I think, would have been in that discussion as well, and is a player that you recently on the show talked about having actually moved ahead of McCaffrey in Dynasty, even as you and I both still think McCaffrey could have one of those seasons that makes you basically impossible to lose almost, because he just has basically only ever been that player. He should still be in the discussion for the 101 and redraft. I think I certainly made that case earlier this offseason. You've convinced me a little bit to back off, and I'm feeling more comfortable with Taylor being the 101 at this stage of the offseason. But I'm going to be excited to draft some McCaffrey this year and redraft him in every format. I still think very, very highly of him. Highly enough that it's worth the risk, even at his age, I think, to go after him and say, well, this guy can probably do this for a few more years, even though he's had some injury concerns. So it's very interesting to me. Waddle goes behind that. Cup goes 301. So to see, I mean, there's a definitely a youth lean here, and rightfully so in Dynasty. A lot of smart drafters. But at a certain point, Cooper Kupp and Christian McCaffrey and those types of players, if you want to win now, I mean, they're obviously great players to have on your roster to try to win now. It's interesting. Where do you think those types of guys would fall? I mean, you as someone who are always taking youth, at what point would you pull the trigger on those types of top 5 redraft assets that don't have the long-term value?
They become very interesting in that range. And it is, I think, this sort of tension between how startups work and how more mature leagues work, and even leagues in kind of their second year where you have your team a little bit more set and you know what some of the trade-offs are going to be because it's a little bit more set. Those quarterback names, I don't necessarily feel like they should all be in the second round. I think that you've got a player with Trevor Lawrence where there's potentially a lot of risk. I think that you have a player with Matthew Stafford where, yes, we would expect him to continue to play for a while, and he's going to have some good weapons. He's going to have some good coaching. But, I mean, do you have the combination of upside and longevity that you want to pay that type of price? Especially, I think they're going to have an explosive season. They're going to score a lot of points. I mean, he's got Cooper Kupp. I mean, just how bad can you be? But we did see them pull back a little bit last year down the stretch. And I think that gets overshadowed some because they do go out and win the Super Bowl. But we saw some of those Matthew Stafford mistakes that the Lions always had to deal with. I mean, Matthew Stafford is just incredible talent. And, when he was out there playing with Megatron, it was the most must-watch TV in the NFL, even though the Lions, unfortunately, weren't that great. But, I struggle with some of those picks in there. And then it's that tension between the positional value for a young guy and then the absurd upside for a player that maybe there's not as much positional value, depending again on how you look at it. Because in Dynasty, the positional value in any given year is still significant, right? And then someone who's an absolute star. So one of the trades I've been looking at in one of my leagues, and it's tough because these are big players and there are other pieces involved, and both sides have a hard time kind of letting go of the person that they have, and they don't want to make a move that in 6 months they're like, I just completely destroyed my roster with this move. I have a team that I drafted with Sam Wallace where we have Trevor Lawrence. He was our first pick. We did the move where we traded out of the first round and into the middle of the second round, and Lawrence fell to us, which at this point is disappointing because he was terrible as a rookie. Right? It would have been great if he had actually gone an ADP and we picked somebody else. But even with that terrible season, he's maintained a lot of his value. You just mentioned him being actually drafted in the same general vicinity that we drafted him at. He is ahead of CMC in general ADP and in a lot of different formats. We then made some different moves as the draft developed to where our league was not as QB heavy as some are. I mean, one of the first things that you want to do in a super flex startup is start to get a feel for where the quarterbacks are going to go and if you're going to have that run in the second round or not. Because I've been in a number of leagues where those quarterbacks go early, and that definitely is an important thing to be aware of, what the prices are going to be, where you need to go, what the trade values you're going to get. I've also been involved in leagues where everybody is essentially playing chicken on the second tier and they go much, much later. And then that tends to have a trickle-down effect where the third tier will go much later. And so we ended up with Tom Brady, Derek Carr, Mac Jones. Brady decides to keep playing. Mac Jones and Derek Carr both see their values jump a little bit. And so then you're thinking to yourself, well, I've got the 3 and, maybe there'll be some future picks. There are some things I can do to add some guys. We also made, this was a pre-NFL draft, rookie draft, and we drafted Howell and Ritter. So we have those QBs as well. And you're looking at that and saying, Trevor Lawrence is someone I could definitely trade for a Christian McCaffrey. And, even now with McCaffrey and the injuries and the age, there's a very strong chance that you can get back out of him if he has the season this year that we're expecting. And so I think that McCaffrey versus Lawrence is a pretty interesting one. And then, Ben, you said that you thought you were going to take Mark Andrews. Mark Andrews is one of my favorite players in the NFL. I think he's obviously one of the top 2 or 3 tight ends. He tends to jump around based on how much the Ravens have thrown recently. And so my question for you would be, I've been lucky on this one because I've been able to sort of buy high and I've been able to buy low and sell high, not the other way around. And that has worked out great with Andrews. Is he someone we would want to be selling? I made a big blockbuster trade in one of my leagues just the other day to move Andrews to a team that was going to be more competitive. This one has Devy, and frankly, most of my guys are college players. I have Patrick Mahomes and college guys. So when I tell family members about it, they always want to know how many points those college guys score for me on Sunday. But
I scored a lot on Saturday, okay?
They just like, if we could just go back. No. So I think that element of it is also interesting. You said you were thinking about taking Andrews over Cooper Kupp in that spot.
Yeah, largely because I felt like he was sort of this happy medium. I wasn't necessarily thrilled. And Andrews is a guy I think I've talked about on the show that I'm not super in on for redraft necessarily, but in a tight end premium, especially in a best ball setting at his age, I mean, he's not young, but I feel very comfortable knowing that he's going to get me a lot of, strong weeks. And then in best ball, I also don't have to take the down weeks when they get very run heavy, right? So there's this element of how much are the Ravens passing lately, but I think some of it's going to be on a week-to-week basis. Certainly they showed us last year they're willing to throw more on a week-to-week basis, whereas in the prior years they were maybe even running one down more. And so there's that element of, okay, well, if I have I don't want to have to invest too much more at tight end if I am taking a tight end that high. But if I have other production at tight end, I can at least get a little bit of a floor or a baseline if Andrews does have some 1 or 2 catch games, some really poor games. But he provides a tight end ceiling that is right there with the elite tight ends. And there's maybe only 5 guys that can really put up the 30-point games at tight end or more. And so, and then you look at it from a dynasty perspective as well. Any concerns about his price relative to redraft, which I do think is a little high based on how much they threw last year. I mean, I've talked about this on the show, I think, but coming into last year, Mark Andrews' career high was about 350 routes in a season. He ran more than 600 last year. So it was an element where his route share went up to, he had always been sort of a part-time route runner, not a 90% route guy. And then he went up into that 90% range, and they had a season where they had 600 dropbacks, which is something the Ravens had not had in his career yet. They mostly had been sub 500 in terms of their overall dropbacks. And so you look at that, you say, okay, their dropbacks can come back to the 500 range. They might not run Andrews on 90% of routes again, although I do think he's kind of broken through that ceiling, and our expectation should be that he is close to a full-time route runner now going forward. But his routes probably have to come down this year when you talk about that big of a jump to a new career high. It wasn't that he was any better necessarily. It was just that he ran a ton more routes. And that's absolutely the kind of guy that I think is probably going to wind up overvalued for redraft in those types of formats. But